I never thought love would lead me to prison, but it did. And it all started with a simple spoon of medicine, the last one I ever gave my husband, Gerald. For 8 long years, Gerald was a prisoner in his own body, a strong, proud man brought to silence by a cruel stroke. His speech was slurred, his legs stopped working, but his mind? It was sharp. Very sharp, and I stayed. Through it all, every single day, I bathed him, fed him, cleaned him when he couldn't control his bowels, changed his clothes, wiped his tears. I turned him in bed at night to prevent sores. I learned how to inject his insulin. I managed his appointments, his therapy, his medicine cabinet that looked more like a pharmacy. I did it all not because I had to, but because I loved him. I loved Gerald with every fiber of my being. I married him 15 years ago, not for his money, but because of the peace he brought into my life. He was calm, kind, and full of wisdom. He never raised his voice, even when the world turned its back on him, including his own blood. Gerald had children from his previous marriage, grown adults who had always hated me from the day I said, "I do." They called me a gold digger, said I was only there for the inheritance. They never gave me a chance. When Gerald had his stroke, I thought they would come around. I thought they'd put aside their hate and come see him, but I was wrong. They visited once, only once, and never came back. They all lived right here in the same state, some just a few miles away. But not one of them lifted a finger, not to call, not to help, not to even ask if he was eating. They were just waiting for the man to die so they could snatch up whatever he left behind. But Gerald saw through them. He knew the truth. And every day he looked at me, he whispered with shaky lips, "Thank you, Margaret, for not leaving me too." That morning started like every other. I helped Gerald to sit up. I warmed his breakfast and crushed his pills. I spooned the mixture into his mouth gently. But halfway through, he stopped chewing. He looked at me with eyes that said too much and yet nothing. He touched my wrist and whispered, "I'm tired." I panicked. "Gerald, don't say that. You're strong. You're still here." He smiled a soft, crooked smile and then, right there in my arms, his head fell to the side. He was gone. Just like that. I screamed. I shook him. I cried his name over and over. But Gerald never moved again. The man I loved, the man I cared for like a child, the man I gave everything for, left this world while I was feeding him his medicine. I couldn't breathe. I was still in my nightgown, kneeling by the bed, holding his hand. My face soaked in tears. I quickly took my phone and placed a call to one of his kids, telling him that their father just passed. While I was beside Gerald's bed, still crying, heard the sound of engines outside. I thought it was the ambulance. I had called them after Gerald collapsed, but it wasn't. It was 4 police cars. They stopped right in front of the gate like it was a crime scene. I wiped my face quickly, confused. What was going on? Then they stormed in. 2 officers entered the house, guns drawn. They asked for me. I was trembling as they told me to step outside. "What's happening?" I asked, completely lost. "Mrs. Margaret Thomas," the officer said sternly, "you are under arrest for the suspected murder of your husband, Gerald Thomas." "Murder?" I cried. "Are you insane? I just don't know what happened. He just died." They didn't care. They handcuffed me right there in my own home, dragged me out in front of neighbors, cameras flashing, people whispering. I was still barefoot, still grieving, still bleeding inside. But they threw me into the back of the police van like I was a monster. In jail, no one listened to me. They kept me in a cold cell for 5 days. No lawyer, no phone call, no food I could eat, no answers. Just whispers from the guards saying, she poisoned her rich husband. And she wanted the house. That's why she did it. They told me Gerald's children had filed a formal complaint that I used some unknown substance to kill him so I could inherit everything. Those ungrateful snakes. The same children who hadn't visited their dying father in years were now pretending to care. They even told the police that I had been pressuring Gerald to change his will, that I was desperate for his money. But all it took was the biopsy. On the 6th day, the forensic report came back. Gerald died of natural causes. No signs of poisoning, no trace of foul play. His body was clean. And just like that, the case was dropped. No apology, no explanation. They opened the gate and said, "You're free to go," as if they hadn't just dragged my name, my soul, and my love through the mud. I returned home, but I wasn't home for long, because the very next day was Gerald's funeral. I wore the only black dress I owned, my face still swollen from crying, my spirit still cracked from jail. But I had to go. I had to say goodbye. I arrived at the church, and as soon as I stepped in, I saw them, Veronica, Gerald's oldest daughter, standing near the coffin like a guard dog. Her brothers, Martin and Louis, standing behind her like bodyguards. I tried to move closer to the coffin to see Gerald one last time, to kiss his forehead. But Veronica blocked my way. "You're not welcome here," she spat. "Excuse me?" I asked. "You heard me. You're not going to pretend to be the grieving widow now. You already had your performance when you killed him." I gasped. People around us started whispering. "Move, Veronica," I said, holding back tears. But she pushed me, right there in front of the church. I stumbled, and not one of her brothers helped me. The pastor stepped in quickly to stop things from escalating. "Let her see her husband," he said quietly. But it was too late. I was already broken. I sat in the back of the church alone, cried quietly through the service. They never let me near the coffin. Not once. But the final blow came after the burial. When I returned to my house, our matrimonial home, every single one of my belongings was on the ground. Clothes, photos, shoes, even my underwear dumped outside like trash. Veronica was standing by the front door with a warning. "If you ever step foot on this property again, we'll call the police. Just because you escaped murder charges doesn't mean you're welcome." She slammed the door behind her. I stood there under the rain, alone, homeless, humiliated. But what they didn't know was that Gerald had already prepared for all this. 2 weeks before his death, Gerald had called our family lawyer, Mr. Benson. He had asked him to update his will. In that will, Gerald left everything to me. The house, his savings, his stocks, even the beach property none of his children knew about. And he made sure to include a clause that said, "No child of mine shall access or benefit from any part of my estate, unless approved directly by my wife, Margaret Thomas." That clause was powerful. It meant even if they tried to claim something, they would have to beg me. And now I had the law on my side. They took my peace, my home, my name. But now I was going to take everything back and teach Gerald's children a lesson they would never forget. It's funny how quickly people forget what you have done for them the moment they think they can walk all over you. After being thrown out of my own house like a dog, I didn't cry. Not this time. I had already cried enough in jail, cried enough at the funeral where I was treated like a stranger to the man I shared 15 years of my life with. But now, I had something stronger than tears, proof. I took the only bag of clothes I could save from the pile they tossed outside and headed straight to Mr. Benson's office. He was Gerald's lawyer, a good man, quiet and patient. He'd handled all Gerald's estate planning and had been trying to reach me since the day after the funeral. I walked into his office, still shaking from the cold and rage. He stood up when he saw me. "Margaret," he said gently, "I've been waiting for you." I sat down, not saying a word. He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is Gerald's updated will," he said, sliding it toward me. "Signed and witnessed 2 months before his passing." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Every line I read made my heart beat faster. Gerald had left everything to me. The house, his cars, the rental apartments, the offshore account, even the 20% shares he owned in his former company. And then there was that clause he wrote, "No person, relative or otherwise, shall benefit from my estate without the signed consent of my wife, Margaret Thomas. My children by blood are hereby excluded from direct access, unless she approves otherwise." I looked at Mr. Benson with wide eyes. "Did they know?" I whispered. He shook his head. "No. Gerald asked me to keep it confidential until after the burial. He knew this might happen, that they might attack you." My fingers tightened on the paper. "Then it's time they find out." The next day, I returned to the house, but not alone. This time, I came with my lawyer, a police officer, and a court-issued order for full possession of the property. Veronica answered the door, still wearing her robe like a queen who thought she had won. When she saw me, her lips curled. "Didn't I tell you never to show your face here again?" Mr. Benson stepped forward. "You may want to take a look at this," he said, handing her the documents. She rolled her eyes and snatched them, but the more she read, the more her face fell. "No," she muttered it. "This can't be right." "It's very right," I said calmly. "Your father left everything to me, and legally, this house and everything in it now belongs to me. You have 24 hours to leave." "You're lying," she screamed. "He would never do this to us. We're his blood." "Then maybe you should have treated him like family while he was still alive," I said sharply. Her brothers, Martin and Lewis, came downstairs, just in time to hear the news. They didn't take it well. Lewis charged toward me, yelling, "You tricked him, you poisoned him and forced him to sign this." The officer stepped forward and blocked him. "Step back, sir, or we'll have to remove you right now." "You can't do this," Veronica hissed. "We will contest it." "You can try," Mr. Benson replied coolly. "But the documents are airtight. And since your names are not listed in the inheritance, you don't even have standing to contest anything." I stood there, not moving, not blinking. "Get out of my house," I said firmly. "And don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you. Because everything you see, every chair, every spoon, every piece of furniture, it's mine now." The next day, they left. But not quietly. They broke 3 windows. They poured bleach on the carpets. They slashed the tires of Gerald's old Mercedes. But I didn't flinch. I filed a police report and replaced everything they damaged. I even had the house deep cleaned, repainted, and reblessed by a local pastor. I refused to let them leave any stain behind. But just as I thought I could finally have peace, something strange happened. A week later, a young woman showed up at my doorstep. She was no more than 25, with soft brown eyes and a nervous smile. "Are you Mrs. Margaret Thomas?" she asked. "Yes. My name is Lydia. I'm Gerald's granddaughter." I stared at her, confused. "Whose child are you?" "Lewis," she said softly. "But he doesn't know I came. He hasn't seen me in years." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "My grandfather used to write me letters when I was younger. After the stroke, he couldn't anymore. But last year, he sent this one through a friend at church." She handed it to me. I opened the envelope and read the short note in Gerald's shaky handwriting. "If you're reading this, Lydia, I may not be around much longer. But if you ever need help, find Margaret. She is the only one who truly loved me. She will help you, as I would have." Tears welled in my eyes. I looked up at the girl. "Do you need help?" I asked. She nodded. "I just left an abusive relationship. I have nowhere to stay." I didn't think twice. I opened the door wide and said, "Then you stay here, with me." Bringing Lydia into the house was the start of something I never expected. Healing. She helped me paint. She helped sort through Gerald's things. She even found old letters he had written to himself, where he talked about his regrets with his children and how proud he was of me, But her presence did more than just comfort me. It triggered Veronica. The moment she found out Lydia was staying with me, she lost her mind. She showed up at the gate 2 days later, shouting, "You're turning my niece against her family now." I laughed bitterly. "You turned her against you long ago. I just gave her a place to breathe." "You think you've won," she screamed. "You haven't seen anything yet." And that's when I decided to strike the final blow. Remember Gerald's company shares? The ones they had tried to secretly access? Well, I had legal control over those now, and I called for a shareholders meeting. At that meeting, I revealed that Gerald had transferred his voting rights to me 6 months before his death, and that Veronica, Martin, and Louis, who had been telling people they were in charge now, had 0 say in the company. Then I made a motion to remove all 3 of them from their minor consulting positions within the company. The board voted unanimously in my favor. All 3 of them were fired. But I wasn't finished. Using part of the money Gerald left me, I launched a scholarship foundation in Gerald's name for students who cared for their sick parents or grandparents. And the face of the campaign? Lydia was. We shared Gerald's story. The man who had been abandoned by his own children but loved fiercely by the woman they all tried to destroy. Months later, the house was peaceful again. Gerald's spirit lingered in every corner, but this time it wasn't haunting. It was comforting. I sat in the garden he loved, drinking tea with Lydia beside me, and finally I felt whole. "I hope they learned something." "I hope they learned something," Lydia said one evening. I smiled. They did. The hard way. Peace was finally settling over the house. For the first time in months, I could sit in Gerald's garden and sip tea without feeling like someone was about to knock down the door or throw accusations my way. Lydia had become like a daughter to me. Kind, respectful, helpful. She had even started calling me Aunt Maggie, which warmed my heart more than I could admit. The pain of Gerald's absence still lingered, but having her around brought light back into these rooms. I thought the storm had passed, but I was wrong. It was just the eye of it. One afternoon, while organizing the attic, something Gerald and I had always meant to do but never got around to, I stumbled on a box. It was buried beneath old Christmas decorations, sealed with aging brown tape, and marked in faded ink, Private Gerald Thomas. He hesitated. Gerald never mentioned anything about a private box. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I sliced the tape open with a rusty key and pulled out its contents. Inside was a stack of handwritten letters, yellowed with age. And beneath those letters was a small envelope. It was sealed tightly and addressed in Gerald's handwriting, to be opened by Margaret only, if I'm gone. My heart thudded in my chest. Hands shaking, I broke the seal. The letter inside was just 2 pages, but by the end of the first paragraph, I felt the ground shift beneath me. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then it means my time has passed and there's something I need to tell you, something I never found the courage to say while I was alive." I leaned in, breathless. "Years before I met you, I had a brief relationship with a woman named Gladys. It wasn't love, just loneliness. I didn't even know she was pregnant when she disappeared. We were never serious. But years later, she reached out with a child named Joel. She said he was mine. I didn't believe it at first, but the resemblance was undeniable. I covered my mouth. Gerald had a child I never knew about? I kept it from everyone, not out of shame, but because I didn't want my other children to find out and try to destroy him too. I set up a small trust fund for Joel in secret. He doesn't know I'm his father. Gladys made me promise to keep it that way. She said he'd be safer not knowing. I blinked back tears. "If you ever come across him, help him. He's a good boy, just like I might have been, if life had been kinder to me." I stared at the page for a long time, unable to move. A hidden son. A secret trust. A promise kept in silence. Gerald had carried this weight all alone, and now it was mine to carry. I told no one at first, not even Lydia. I needed time to think. But the trust fund Gerald mentioned caught my attention. I called Mr. Benson and asked if he knew anything about a separate trust fund outside the will. He paused. I did manage something for Gerald a few years back, he said. He asked me to open a small account under the name of Joel G. Matthews. I assumed it was a distant nephew or something. Why? I need to find him, I said, quietly. With Mr. Benson's help, it took 2 weeks to track him down. Joel was 22 years old, a welder's apprentice, lived in a modest neighborhood, no social media, no known connections to Gerald. But when I saw his picture, my heart skipped. He had Gerald's eyes, the same serious, thoughtful gaze, the same strong jawline. There was no denying it. He had Gerald's eyes, the same serious, thoughtful gaze, the same strong jawline. There was no denying it. Gerald was his father. I didn't know how to approach him at first. I drove past his house 3 times before finally parking and stepping out. He was outside, shirt stained with grease, fixing what looked like an old generator. "Excuse me," I called gently. He looked up, courteous but polite. "Are you Joel?" "Yeah. Can I help you?" I forced a smile. "My name is Margaret Thomas. I knew your mother, Gladys." He froze. "You did?" "Yes, I was married to someone she used to know, Gerald Thomas." Joel stood up slowly, brushing off his hands. "I never met him," he said. "My mom used to say he wasn't the kind of man who stuck around." I swallowed hard. "That's not true. He was complicated, but he cared." Joel looked at me carefully. "Why are you here?" I took a deep breath. "Because he left something behind for you. A trust. A small inheritance. He wanted to make sure you were okay." Joel stared, stunned. "Why would a man who didn't even know me do that?" "Because he did know you," I said softly. "More than you think." I didn't tell him the full truth, not yet. But I gave him Mr. Benson's card and told him he could claim the trust whenever he was ready. Then I left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by Gerald's side of the bed, staring at the spot where he used to lie. "I met him, Gerald," I whispered. "Your son. You would have been proud." But one last thing was left for me to do, which was in my mind. And keep disturbing my soul, it was to tell Joel the truth and who his father was. Joel wasn't asking for anything. He didn't even know the truth yet. But I had a decision to make. Should I tell Joel the truth? Should I tell him who his father really was? After much contemplation, I decided to open up the next day. The next morning, I went to Joel's house again. This time, I brought the letter. I told him everything. He didn't say a word for the longest time, just stared into the distance. Then he finally spoke. "I always thought I was a mistake, that maybe I wasn't supposed to be born. But now," he looked at me, "now I know I came from someone who tried to protect me, even if from a distance." I nodded, tears in my eyes. "He did. He really did." I said to him, after Joel accepted the truth about Gerald, after Gerald's children lost their lawsuit, after Lydia and I had finally found peace in our home again, I believed the storm had passed. But evil doesn't sleep, and greed, it always finds a way to crawl back. It was Veronica again. It started with a phone call from Mr. Benson. One evening, I got a phone call from Benson Gerald's lawyer. "Margaret," he said, voice tight. "We have a situation." My heart dropped. "What now?" Veronica submitted a second will, one dated just 3 days before Gerald died. I froze. "What?" "She claims it was the true final will, and in it, Gerald leaves everything to her and her brothers. You're nowhere in the document." I sat down, my hands trembling. "That's not possible. Gerald was barely able to sign his name during those last few days." "I know, and that's why it's not adding up." Mr. Benson explained that she'd filed the new will through a different lawyer, one her friend allegedly worked for. She said Gerald had a moment of clarity and made a final change before his death. "She's pushing hard to get this version admitted in court," Mr. Benson warned. "If she succeeds, it could nullify the original will. It didn't make sense. But then again it did. Veronica was desperate. She had lost everything. She was willing to do anything, including forgery. I didn't wait. I drove straight to the house of Joel, the son Gerald never claimed in public, but whom I had grown to trust. He had my calm, Gerald's kindness. "I need your help," I told him. "Anything," he said without blinking. "I need a blood sample." Mr. Benz. After I got his blood sample, Mr. Benson and I quickly hired a forensic handwriting expert and a private investigator. While the expert examined the alleged new will, the investigator focused on the law firm Veronica used, and it didn't take long to uncover the truth. The lawyer who filed the new will, not even licensed anymore. He'd lost his license due to unethical behavior 5 years ago. The notary, who supposedly stamped the new document, dead. Buried 2 years ago in a small town upstate. And the handwriting on the new will? Not Gerald's. The expert concluded it was a copy-paste signature, traced and scanned from an old car title Gerald had signed in Coxituhatta Kuusitoista. Veronica had tried to cheat the law. It got even worse. It was hard to believe, but when Mr. Benson called me that day and told me about the second will Veronica had somehow managed to get filed, I knew this wasn't just about money anymore. This was something far worse. Veronica, Martin, and Lewis weren't just after the house, they wanted to destroy me. And they were willing to do whatever it took. But here's the thing about desperation. People make mistakes when they're desperate. And when they think no one's watching, they do things that can come back to haunt them. That's where Mr. Crane came in. I had hired him after the lawsuit had been dismissed, just in case they tried anything else. I knew Veronica wasn't going to give up easily. She was too determined to tear me down. Mr. Crane was a quiet, methodical man, the kind who looked at a problem from every angle. He wasn't a typical private investigator. He didn't rush in with guns blazing. No, he was precise, patient, and he knew how to dig deep without drawing attention to himself. After he had access to the initial court records and the filings for the second will, he went straight to the source, the phones. I needed evidence, something irrefutable. I gave Mr. Crane full access to any potential leads. He had a special contact who worked in cyber forensics, someone who could dive into phones and computer backups like they were nothing. It wasn't long before they discovered something, and when he told me, I was floored. Lewis, one of Gerald's sons, had recently taken his phone into a repair shop. Apparently, it had a cracked screen, so he needed it fixed. That repairman had done more than just put on a new screen. He had inadvertently backed up all Lewis's phone data to an online cloud system during the process. The repairman didn't know it, but all the messages Lewis had sent and received were stored there, sitting like an open book. Mr. Crane and his cyber expert were able to retrieve all those messages from the backup, and what they found? Well, it was everything I needed. They pulled out a conversation from a chat app called WhatsChat, one that I had never heard of, but apparently it was the siblings' go-to app for their private conversations. Here's what they found in a thread between Veronica and Lewis, dated right around the time the second will was supposedly created. Lewis. She's gaining sympathy with the secret son thing. We need to move fast. Veronica. Don't worry. I've already got someone faking the papers. We'll show the world she forged the first one. Lewis. It has to look real. If she wins, we're done. Veronica. She's going down. One way or another. There it was. The smoking gun. Right in black and white. Veronica and Lewis had been plotting to forge Gerald's signature on that second will, planning to frame me for the original will's fraud, and they had someone lined up to fake the paperwork. They were desperate enough to ruin their own father's legacy just to get what they felt was owed to them. Mr. Crane and the forensic expert did their magic, pulling out the data in a way that couldn't be challenged in court. They showed timestamps, matching the location of where the messages were sent, even confirming the devices that had sent them. It was undeniable. When we got the text messages verified and presented them in court, there was no way for Veronica and her brothers to explain it away. The truth came out. They hadn't just tried to steal from me, they had been plotting my downfall from the moment Gerald died. And that was when I knew it was over for them. They had finally messed with the wrong woman. They were willing to destroy me. Again. But this time, I was ready. In court, everything came crashing down. Mr. Benson presented the original will, Gerald's letter to me, and the results from the handwriting analysis. We presented the extracted messages from their phones. Their lies were laid bare. The judge's words were short, but sharp. This court finds the alternate will fraudulent. The defendants, Veronica, Lewis, and Martin Thomas, are found guilty of attempted estate fraud, forgery, and contempt of court. They were arrested right there in court. And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Justice. It felt like a deep, cleansing rain. Not just for me, but for Gerald, who had suffered so much, and for Joel, whose existence was nearly erased again, and for Lydia, who stood beside me with tears in her eyes as the gavel fell. But I wasn't done yet. No, Gerald's children had stolen too many years, caused too much pain. If they thought jail was the worst that could happen, they were wrong. I went straight to the media. For the first time, I told my story publicly and exposed all their evil.